Hello, hello. Everyone hear me? You good? I'm not used to wearing a mic, so especially like a little pin one here. How y'all doing? Good, good. So thanks for joining us. Yes, this is like our official API kickoff week and celebration. And yeah, we just wanted to recognize that there's this stereotype of Asian Americans. So we want to recognize that and have this discussion. So thanks for being here. My disclaimer is I'm going to kick this off with some historical fact, and I know there's a history professor in the room, so please be easy on me, Professor Hashima. Oh, good, he stepped out, so I can misquote a lot of stuff now. All right, so model minority myth, all Asians doing just fine. So really want to kick this off, but I don't want us to take too much time for some of our guest speakers and our student panel. So what are some of the stereotypes of Asians? Can we have a real talk? Real talk, right? Yeah, go ahead. They're smart. But say it loud. They're good at math. What else? Bad drivers. Okay. Yes, sir.
Polite all the time.
Polite all the time? All right, come on.
Quiet.
Quiet, right. Any others? Cool, cool. Yeah, John.
Eat dogs.
Eat dogs.
Probably the tiger mom stereotype.
Tiger mom stereotype, yeah, right. So, thank you. Thanks for being honest with those stereotypes too, because those are real things that many people in the Asian community are deemed as having those stereotypes placed upon them. So, going back to the history of this and showing this thing is not batteries in it? Okay. So in U.S. propaganda and history, before those stereotypes were placed, these were some of the ones that were placed through propaganda. The Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, right? They're worried that Chinese people were taking away jobs from the U.S. people. World War II. This is from actually Dr. Seuss drawing, right? His numbers, he has so increased that now he's millions at least. And as he grows, this yellow beast, he keeps one eye fixed on the east. And then we all know the story of the Japanese internment camps, right? So these are some of the stereotypes that was placed upon the Asians at that time. And now we move fast forward to all the ones that you talked about, especially revolving around the model minority myth. This thing is. All right, so here we are in the more recent times, right? We have Time Magazine, Whiz Kids that are kind of talking about being smart, right? And being like highly educated. Even up to Mr. O'Reilly, as some people call him, about Asian privilege in America, and that since Asians are making more money, they have more privilege than even white Americans, okay? So that's where we're at currently. So breaking down the beginnings of the model minority myth was first introduced by William Peterson in January 1966 in the Time Magazine success story, Japanese American Style. In that article, he credited Japanese Americans with their culture, their background, their support systems, as being able to make it after even 20 years of being incarcerated and placed in those internment camps. Again, I'm not a history teacher, so I had to do some research. So, y'all set me up. All right, so, but overlooked in the Immigration Act of 1965, which started allowing more immigrants to come in. Prior to that, there was again, we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. They started letting in Chinese immigrants in the 1940s because of the war that was taking place with Japan. And they wanted to use Chinese as an ally to battle against Japan in World War II. So they started allowing more Chinese immigrants into the country, although being limited. Fast forward into 1965, a year before that article came out, which it overlooked, this Immigration Act only allowed the highly skilled, educated Asian doctors, engineers, teachers to immigrate here. And so that began the kind of the knowledge of, okay, there's a model minority, very highly successful, highly educated Asians that were coming in. And now that term was now being pitted against those of the African American communities or even the Mexican communities that were so supposedly deemed the problem immigrants or problem minorities, right? So this tried to create a wedge and kind of talk about racism as not being really truly an issue because, look, we have all these so-called minorities, some that were even in internment camps, that are able to be successful. How come the black community or the Mexican community can't do as well, right? So there's really no institutional racism at that time. So problems with this myth, right? Go through my notes here. Problems with the myth that some people argue that this myth is really a positive look on Asian Americans. But we all know this is not. This is a self-imposed stereotype placed on the Asian American community. So some of the problems with this myth: Asian American students are less likely to seek out assistance in times of emotional stress. They don't want to seek out help because in their minds that they've adopted this model minority myth that, well, I'm supposed to be strong, I'm supposed to be successful, I don't need to ask for help. If I ask for help, it's deemed as a weakness. Some society and self-imposed pressure perform well may actually have a negative effect on the academic performance of students versus those that are already struggling with school. They're added pressure on themselves and not doing well at all. And there's also the intentional distancing from being a high achiever. So to avoid getting bullied or to avoid discrimination from both teachers and peers, they rather step back and not do as well in their class because they don't want to be part of that stereotype. All right. And then also, just the lack of this study on Asian Americans and not being deemed as like a blanket or a broad, like Asians are part of this one collective group, and instead of studying them individually, there's a lack of institutional resources aren't given to those that are in need because supposedly all Asians are doing just fine. So Asian populations have a large variety of differences in both educational background, ethnic origin, the migrant status, socioeconomic status, and just because the data, which we'll have a guest speak on his research, is being misinterpreted and of how the data is being collected. So all this leads to the exclusion of Asian Americans from conversations concerning support for the marginalized communities in the Asian American population. So, which kind of segues now to, I want to invite Gabriel Garcia here, who's done some amazing work through California on trying to get to that data and dismantling that data and disaggregating the data so we could really break down the Asian population. So I'm going to invite him to come up. Gabriel Garcia is a part of the Boys and Men of Color Coordinator, part of CRAC, the Southeast Asian Resource Action Center. And again, I'd like to invite him up and share the research he's been doing. And that way we can really see the breakdown of disparities in the Asian community. So give him a hand. Really awesome.
All right, I'm going to take off this jacket because I'm getting a little toasty, and I don't want to sweat in front of everybody as I do my presentation. Can I have everybody, if you're comfortable, if you're able, just stand up real quick and just shake off that model minority myth that we've all been fed our whole lives? And if you want to keep sitting down, just shake off what you can. Cool, thank you. So Like Roger was saying, my name is Gabriel Garcia. I'm here with the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center to talk about something that we all get very excited about, data, right? We all love learning about data. And the reason that data is so important when it comes to the model minority myth is inadequate data is what has led to this myth over time. So in order to dismantle this myth, we need to look really finely at the data that's available. And I'm going to try to not say data that much throughout this presentation if I can. So yeah, let me know when you're ready. Cool. I don't know how this myth came to exist when there's so much diversity within the Asian American Pacific Islander community. We have over 50 different ethnicities, over 100 different languages spoken. That's a crazy amount of diversity. So how do people lump all these groups into one monolithic giant category? Naturally, when this diversity occurs, there's going to be disparities, right? We have diverse immigration stories. We have diverse histories when it comes to actually our communities coming together in America. So it's going to lead to disparities. I'm talking economic disparities, disparities when it comes to education. But all of these disparities and challenges become invisible when we can't see them, when the data is not showing that they exist. And when the data doesn't show what's going on with each community, those disparities remain over time so that we have inequality that still exists today. Go ahead to the next slide. So when we do look at what information we have available, we can see huge diversity and disparities within Asian American data, right? Over 60 percentage points when it comes to bachelor degree attainment for ages over 25, with Indian Americans having 70% bachelor attainment rate compared to Southeast Asian Americans who have some of the lowest educational attainment rates in the state. Laotian and Pacific Islanders as well. But this is data that would not be visible to us if all we looked at was Asian American, which is right here in the middle, right? It looks great to have a group having 49% bachelor degree attainment, especially when the California total is just 30%. But that it tells a very incomplete picture of what's actually going on with each individual community. And when all that data is lumped together, we're missing so much of the picture. And these communities' needs remain invisible, so that that model minority myth perpetuates itself. People think, oh, Asians are doing fine. Look at that data. It looks great. They don't need any supports. They don't need any help. We don't need to focus on them, right? But it doesn't just exist in education. When it comes to economics and poverty, we know that the data shows a very similar story, with Hmong and Cambodian students, or children, having the highest rate of childhood poverty in the state of California. Has anybody seen this data before? No, right? It's not something that we're told about. It's not something that's readily available to the average person. But it is the reality of our communities throughout California that, again, remains invisible unless we actually break it down by subgroup to see what's going on. Go ahead. So just to give a little bit of background about my work, and about myself, I'm actually Mexican and Filipino, so my data is like all over the place when it comes to my outcomes, right? But for my work, I'm the Boys and Men of Color coordinator for CRAC, and I lead a coalition of organizations all around the state that work with Asian American Pacific Islander groups, especially youth. And we came together because we know that our voices are always stronger when we work together. And it all came about in response to this model minority myth that still exists for some reason. So we decided to use our collective power as organizations to put out a survey to our youth, to our different communities all around the state, to see what's actually going on with our young people, right? So we have about a dozen organizations that contributed to this. We got over 800 survey responses asking questions on economics, education, neighborhood safety, community safety, interaction with the criminal justice system, and mental health. Just to get a broad perspective, what's going on with our young people? Because this is something that we're missing, right? There's not a lot of people going to the community, doing this kind of data, making it available, and actually talking to the young people about it. So we also conducted 5 focus groups around the state in San Jose, Santa Ana, Long Beach, Stockton, and Fresno, just to get a feel for whether our data was accurate. So actually asking youth who took the survey, does this data reflect your experiences? And then asking them, how does it reflect your experiences, right? Because we actually need to know, the data can tell us a lot, but we need to know what it means in the day-to-day life of a person for it to be meaningful. So with that data, so this is basically what I just said. We have groups in the Central Valley, the Bay Area, and Southern California. And then you can see that we got a good representation. Because a lot of our partners work with the Southeast Asian community, we had a good representation of Southeast Asian communities like Hmong, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Mien or Yumien, Laotian, and even multiracial Southeast Asian. So keep in mind with the data is kind of the breakdown that we get. It is not at all representative of our actual demographics in California, because if it was, Chinese and Filipino would take up most of this graph, right? And we have plenty of data on what's going on with Chinese and Filipino youth. It's really helpful to know what's going on with the youth that don't get surveyed very often. So some of our key findings when it came to economic security is that Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander students and youth face significant socioeconomic challenges. So we saw some of the poverty outcomes earlier, right? Our data confirmed and affirmed a lot of those findings. When it comes to school culture and climate, what was really interesting is that as much as we talk about disaggregating and breaking down data, across all groups we saw high rates of bullying among Asian American and Pacific Islander students. And a lot of the bullying, when I did the focus groups, contained many of the stereotypes we talked about earlier, which were, something that the youth experienced in the verbal harassment that they went through on their day-to-day lives. When it came to mental health, we saw traces of intergenerational trauma that Southeast Asian American students had experienced because of their family's experience as refugees coming to this country. And then for neighborhood culture and climate, when we broke down the data by location, because it was a statewide survey, we could see that there are pockets of Asian American communities geographically that have wildly different experiences than their counterparts in different parts of the state, which is something that we need to pay attention to as well. And then finally, with interaction with the criminal justice system, we saw that young men specifically are more likely to feel pressure to join gangs as a response to all of these different challenges they face in their lives. So one of the questions we asked is, my family is never worried about having enough money to pay all our bills. And if you'll remember the disaggregated data on poverty, you'll see that a lot of this lines up with what we already know. So this is the percentage that disagreed or strongly disagreed with this statement. And the point of breaking down this data is not to say that this is statistically significant or that these statistics should be taken as scientific fact, but really to show the diversity of experiences that our youth are going through, right? When we talk about, or when we try and put all Asians into a category, we are ignoring all this diversity and all of these disparities and keeping them invisible if we're not breaking it down and talking about it and actually engaging communities with it, right? Go to the next slide. And we saw, when it comes to socioeconomic challenges, that language access is also a huge issue. So when Roger was talking about earlier, we have immigration laws in place that actually make it so that a lot of folks can only come over if they're highly educated and have access to resources that make acclimation to America a lot easier, or if they're highly resourced and they have a lot of money to come over. This paints a completely different picture from our refugee communities, like Yumien, Laotian, Hmong, Cambodian, who were forced out of their homes because of the conflicts in Southeast Asia in the 1970s. So we have a huge difference here, and this is largely informed by immigration stories, right? But again, when we break down the data, it's also helpful to see similarities that our communities are experiencing. And there were a lot of similar themes across groups around the racial discrimination, verbal bullying, and a lot of the racial targeting that they had experienced. A lot of times, our students who are still struggling in education, like Southeast Asian American students, still get that model minority myth thrown at them when it comes to bullying, right? Which is doubly harmful because A, they're not getting the support they need to succeed in school, and B, people assume that they don't need support. So it's this double concoction that's really harmful for our students, and we saw it in the bullying that they experienced as well. And then when it comes to mental health, when we look at having a positive adult allies at home that support and mentor them when they're having problems, we see again a disparity between communities who were forced out of their homes, like Southeast Asian American communities, and communities that might have voluntarily immigrated to this country, right? There's a different dynamic when there is a decision collectively made to immigrate to the United States and to have a base of family here in the United States versus being forced out of your home and trying to resettle with very little resources, right? And then when we broke down the data geographically, this really jumped out at us, where our youth in Stockton, which most people don't even recognize as having a large API population, was experiencing huge feelings of lacking safety in their neighborhoods, right? So community safety isn't always something we think about as an API issue, but obviously we have API community members who are experiencing this in places around the country, or around the state. And only by also breaking it down geographically and comparing it to our statewide data can we say that it's almost 3 times the rate that everybody else around the state is experiencing. Stockton is also home to, I think, the 5th largest Cambodian population in the United States. So when we look at the overlap between Cambodian Americans feeling unsafe and Stockton respondents feeling unsafe, we see a huge overlap there because that's the place where a lot of folks were resettled. But again, knowing what's going on in California, who here has heard about housing and the cost of living getting more expensive? It's pretty much everybody's reality across the state, right? This is something that we saw even in places, I don't know if you remember Stockton and Oakland were the places where folks felt the least safe. These also had the highest percentages of people feeling that they couldn't afford to stay in the areas where they live in. So we have youth that are feeling both unsafe and unstable when it comes to their housing situations, which again, these are not really things that people think about as API issues. But obviously, we have community members that are going through this. And then when it comes to interaction with the criminal justice system and overlapping with mental health, we saw differences when we broke down by gender when it comes to how men and young women experience the trauma and troubles that they're going through, right? Some folks may have positive coping mechanisms, and that keeps them out of trouble, you know, allows them to rejuvenate their mental health. Other folks might not. And only when we see this data can we actually pay attention to, okay, what's going on with our Asian American and Pacific Islander young men, as well as our young women, right? Because unless we do that, we don't know how to target our solutions better to accommodate what's going on with them. So we walked away with some recommendations. Like I said, I tried not to say data too much during this presentation, but it is one of our key recommendations, right? And this goes across institutions when it comes to criminal justice institutions, when it comes to educational institutions. Disaggregating data and breaking it down where we can is really important to actually illuminating what's going on with our communities, because we would know none of these things if we weren't able to actually get the data from our communities and break it down, right? And I know it's not the most fun topic to talk about, but it is absolutely the necessary foundation to everything else that we need to address. And then 2, having culturally informed K through 12, and I would adjust to say second, higher education institutions, and ethnic studies curriculums. So we did a hearing in November reporting on some of the results of our survey. And one thing that really came out was our community members saying that we need ethnic studies curriculums that address the diversity of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Because obviously, due to the high rates of bullying, and especially like the racially targeted bullying, there are folks that just don't know about the diversity in these communities. And only by actually educating our youth and our community members and engaging them in this kind of education can we really address that like ignorance and stereotypes that's taking place in our schools. Additionally, I'm sure I have other ethnic studies proponents in the room, but there's research that shows that ethnic studies actually boosts GPA, increases attendance, and can increase the amount of units earned by students that are taking ethnic studies curriculums. So I'll put that little plug in there too, because it's something that we see a double benefit from. And then third, this overlaps a lot, but cultural competency and relevancy across institutions, again, is really important, especially when it comes to health and mental health. In Asian American Pacific Islander communities, mental health is oftentimes stigmatized, right? It's something that folks don't talk about even when there is a glaring issue that should be addressed. It's something that might stay in the home. It's something that people might not go outside of their family unit for help for, right? But by really investing and building up culturally competent models to address this, we can see a lot of potential for addressing this for not only our elders, but also our youth and our young people. And then finally, investing in social safety nets and just social programs in general, and making sure that those are going to Asian American Pacific Islander communities. Like I said, when you look at just Asian American data, you don't get the full picture. And you might not see that these folks also need resources. But when you do break it down, you can see that there is a lot of area and potential for us to invest. And a lot of times folks say that communities are at risk. We try not to say that. We like to say instead that communities are at potential, because if we do invest in them, we could see a huge return on our investments by empowering those communities. So that's pretty much it for the original research that I wanted to share out. I do have some additional information around what we've been doing at the statewide level to try and get more data disaggregated. One bill that we had in 2016 was AB 1726. Who here has heard of this bill? It was our data disaggregation bill. Cool, no hands. That's what I like to see. It was essentially to get the Department of Public Health and Department of Healthcare Services, as well as the 3 pillars of our public higher education institutions, to disaggregate their data. Because we want to know what's going on with our young people. We want to know what's going on with our communities. And in addition to some of the other communities that they already collect data on, we added these 10 additional categories. Now, what's some of the data that might be useful? I know this is kind of a spoiler, but what's some of the data that you guys think might be useful when it comes to education? I got answers on the board for you, so it's pretty easy. What's that? Graduation rates, exactly, yeah. That's good, that's good. I should put that on there next time. Yeah, graduation rates, right? We want to know how our students are doing when it comes to actually getting a degree, and that's across institutions, right? Especially when it comes to transfer students, and how long it's taking them to transfer, what supports we might be able to offer in those areas. Graduation rates is definitely something that we'd like to look into. Yeah?
Field of study choice?
Yeah, field of study choice. What are students going into? If there is a lot of representation in one area, then it's kind of easy to target resources towards that area. We see that a lot of students are going towards one area. Financial aid recipients, absolutely. Yeah, that would be helpful to know, right? If we have students that are dropping out because of these economic challenges that we can see in the data, Why wouldn't we want to know that those students are also getting the financial aid they need to succeed, right? Yeah, tutoring services, access of services in general, right? A lot of times students may not know what's even available to them. Yeah. Right, and a lot of times we know that institutions might not be able to, or might not think to track those for certain communities, right? But it's definitely something that's really important. Yeah, housing on campus, these are all really good things. Okay, I'll take one more.
In the work-study programs?
Yeah, right. It's access to these programs, access to services, access to housing. All these things are really important for us to understand and know, especially when it comes to smaller communities like Southeast Asian American communities, like Pacific Islander communities, who maybe are not the size that would automatically trigger administrators knowing about some of the needs, right? Because some of these communities are a lot smaller. But by investing in these communities, there's a huge return on investment because they are a lot smaller. It's easier to target resources towards those students. Go ahead, Roger. So we did a whole statewide campaign. That's the bill's author, Assemblyman Rabanta. He represents the Bay Area. And we brought a bunch of folks out from around the state to talk about why this kind of representation is so important in the data. So why do you think people might have been opposed to this?
Like complicated data here.
What's that?
Like might complicate the process how they can gather data.
Yeah, it adds another process for gathering and reporting data, right? There's somebody that has to do that work and they might not be happy about it. Any other ideas? Actually, yeah. Go ahead, Roger. We had opposition from some really conservative factions of Chinese American folks who wanted to maintain the status quo because they didn't want it to be revealed how much these disparities existed, right? Because if we revealed that Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander students were really in need of, increasing their higher education outcomes, they were afraid that it might push them out, them and their children out of these opportunities, which was absolutely something that the bill didn't aim to do. We really just wanted to illuminate what was going on with our communities. So there was a lot of crazy things that were said in response to it. We have our bill number on a Star of David. They compared it a lot to Nazi Germany, which I'm still trying to unpack how they made those connections. And they also connected it to that North Carolina bathroom law here in California, which I can tell by some of your faces you're as confused as I am on how they made that connection. But that was some of the craziness that we went through when trying to pass this bill. So at the end of the day, we actually ended up taking out the education portion of the bill and sticking to the health portion because it was really clear that Governor Brown would not sign the bill with the education components attached. Some of it was due to costs, some of it was due to the administrative overhaul, complicating the process of actually reporting out the data. Fortunately, we had been having ongoing conversations with the University of California and the California State Universities to actually disaggregate some of their data. So what we see now is that their data is disaggregated, but it is just by enrollment, which doesn't tell us a whole lot. I mean, we all shared some really good ideas about what data would be helpful, right? And this is nowhere close to giving us that data, but it is a step in the right direction. And then we know for the California State University that there is a priority for disaggregating data by race, gender, first generation, underrepresented communities, and socioeconomic status to track student progress because they want to boost educational outcomes for their students. And then there is also a California Community College Research and Planning Group that has recommended to the Chancellor's Office to expand and coordinate the number of ethnicity and ancestry categories. I think that they had originally originally proposed replacing the 21 current ethnicity categories with 139 expanded categories, which, as we know, might complicate the process, but it would get us closer to revealing some of that data for our students, which we know is absolutely necessary to understanding what's going on with them. So are there any questions on anything I just said? I know I threw a lot at us. Totally fine with doing that. Yeah. If you guys have any questions, though, this is my contact information. I'll be here. I have cards. Let me know. Okay.
So I want to invite our student panel up. We have about 20 minutes, so I want to make sure I give them enough time to tell their story. But as you all come up, it's important. I know the numbers. I'm not like a data collector, stats person. I'm glad Gabriel's done amazing work with that. That's not my area of strength. Even though but it's important, right? Because if we're talking about resources, especially when we put them in the transfer, right? Eventually transfer or get resources for not just yourself, but for the community and people like you to get the resources needed towards those community groups, right? So this data is being used to create policy change, right? Create things at the government level, at the UC levels, at these different institutions to create these resources for students. So maybe it's not great, exciting, sexy work, but it's necessary work that needs to be done as part of the social justice fight. So really thankful for the work that Gabriel's doing. So the numbers are very dry, but we need to add voices and a heartbeat to those data, right? And so that's why I invited our student panel to kind of give voice to those numbers. I think I'm supposed to use this so I can, yeah. Oh, put it up here. All right. Oh, this one is on. All right. Oh, it's on. Okay. So, so I wanted to just get to know the panel and get to know their stories. So first, let's just please introduce yourself, your preferred name, your major, your ethnicity, pronouns, and we'll just go right across the way. Yeah.
Hello? Okay. So my name is James. I am Vietnamese American. I major in linguistics and I go by he, him pronouns.
My name is Johnny Vu. I'm a Hmong American. Now, my major is business administration.
Hi, I'm Angeline Noel Cabrera. I go by Jelly because it's easy. I'm a language studies and social science major here, just because they don't have linguistics, but I'm transferring to UCSB to go study that. As for ethnicities, I say I am an American Filipino rather than a Filipino American. Yeah. I go by she pronouns.
Hi, my name is Ming Shan. I'm Chinese. My major is communication and I go by she.
Hey y'all, my name is Quinn. I'm a science major, biology probably. I identify as Vietnamese American and I use any pronouns.
All right. So thank you for being here. Let's give it up for them for being here and volunteering. All right. So first question, and just know that we're running up on time here, so maybe some of you could answer some of these questions and we'll just jump around, whoever feels most confident answering this question. So the first question, when did you realize that your race, your ethnicity was important for you to be identified by beyond the umbrella term of Asian, and how has that affected you?
So, funny story. I didn't realize I was Vietnamese until I was 7. I thought I was Chinese for the longest time. Like, I even thought I was related to Mulan somehow. Yeah, so I grew up with like a very strong connection to like my Vietnamese roots at a very early age because both my parents were fluent. But as I grew up, like that connection kind of deteriorated because there were less people like me in the North Sacramento area, and then eventually I kind of felt a bit more ashamed of my identity because I felt like I was just the only one. And it felt, I felt very left out about like, let's see. Yeah, so I ended up feeling kind of like I just had no one to really talk to about issues, and then I end up getting kind of projected stereotypes that don't, I felt never really applied to me, and just being very confused, like just in school settings and just not understanding what was going on.
Yeah, so I realized my race and ethnicity was important to me probably when I started applying for colleges and finding trade, all that stuff. Because man, it goes down to the race and ethnicity. Was I never really see Hmong there. And then so when I apply for applications and stuff, I'm just like, how come Hmong people are not that representative on these forums and stuff?
Growing up in the Bay, I was surrounded by a lot of Filipinos and other types of Asians, so I never really found it important personally. I mean, there was like a minute in my life where it was popular to really rep your ethnicity or whatever. We were pretty much just making racial gangs on campus. And then I realized like it didn't really matter because that it was just one part of me. At the same time though, I want to, especially with college, I feel like in the same way I've really come to this point where I want to make the fact that I am Filipino more a part of my life, because it kind of said, oh well, it's just a part of me, but yeah.
I'm actually an international student. I was born and raised in China. I think I come here like 3 years ago as exchange student, so I don't really feel into the umbrella of Asian because I was like hanging around with all Asian countries. But I feel more of identify after I came over here because there's a lot of Asian identities and like influenced me. And the high school I went to, we have a big popularity of like like Chinese American or Asian Americans, and they're really like hard study peoples. Like I think it affects me a lot.
So, as I said before, I identify as Vietnamese American, but it took a very long time for me to really like sit in that, just because in a lot of Southeast Asian communities, like some really quick history, the reason how a lot of the Southeast Asians came to America, as Gabe said, was because of the refugee crisis, right? And so even like within Southeast Asian American communities, there's still like a very large disparity. And so for me personally, I was privileged enough to have parents that like came over in the first wave, and so they were the ones who like had the resources to come over sooner, could like speak English faster and so forth. And so I recognize that I came from a very like privileged place, and so I didn't really identify myself with the other side, quote unquote, of Southeast Asians. So like my best friend lived a very different life than me, and you know lived all of these like struggles. And so I think rather than distancing myself from anything else, I distanced myself from my Asian American identity because I was in a privileged space to be able to put that aside. Whereas like a lot of my Southeast Asian counterparts, they aren't able to like take that off and put it to the side because it's like what they come home to, it's what they see in their parents' eyes, it's what, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I think it definitely took me a moment to be like, I'm Southeast Asian, but I have a responsibility to my community. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So with that identity, and now with this like mainstream look of like being a model minority, how's that stereotype or that myth affected you personally, academically, socially? And on top of that, I'm just going to combine the two questions is, what do you believe is the biggest perpetrator of pushing the narrative of that model minority myth?
That was for the third question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just combine them.
Combine them?
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't, growing up there was definitely a lot of pressure for my parents and my family and stuff to do good in school in an early age. And it was just, so that put a lot of pressure on me because Asian parents, they always compare you to like your siblings or your cousins or your sisters or whatever. And then I think the biggest perpetrator of pushing the narrative for model minority myth is, I will have to say, I believe it's Asian people, like, because I feel like if I don't perform as good as another Asian, then I'm like inferior or something. But then I think we just need to like stop that kind of thinking going towards the future.
I felt that a lot of my education felt trivialized, that all my abilities were just inherent because of my race rather than hard work or like things I was talented in. And so it led me to actually underperform really harshly and on purpose in high school because I felt that there wasn't really like a need for me to really, there was like no point in me doing any of this because I felt that if I underperformed, maybe I could stand out, which is really stupid looking back, but yeah, so it kind of made me feel like I was a caricature, and I didn't really feel like I was kind of like a holistic student until like college, where I felt people like me, have stories similar to me, and knew that like my struggles weren't just me, you know.
I don't think my parents or me really ever heard of the term model minority until just recently. Though I think they have bought into the whole idea of it. Growing up, it's just like you were told you had to be outstanding, you had to be excellent in anything you do, whether it be in school or in your career or something like that. You had to give 110%. You had to be the best candidate. It was an expectation rather than something you were praised for, though I have a loving family and they have praised me for it, but at the same time, if I got like an A minus, like why not an A plus, that kind of thing. As for biggest perpetrator, I agree with like Johnny. It's the people who've actually supported me to be the person I am today, be as successful as I can be, because they're the ones who have pushed me to be this perfect thing that I'm not, and still striving to be, even though we're talking about it being a myth. So yeah.
Because I'm an international student, so I have like kind of different perspective of this. When I went to the high school, the called Mara Loma, I met a lot of Asian out there that work like extra harder than the people who I know in Chinese high school. Then carries a lot. It's not just because of the like expectation from their families or something. It's just like them were willing to do it like that. And there's one of my classes, like the professor was saying, like, since you're Asian, I'm expecting you to be good at this class. But that's just the first day of the class, but you don't even know me or anything. Yeah.
I definitely like resonate with the things that they've said. I think there's definitely an element of like hidden struggle, I guess, where everyone kind of expects you to do well, but they don't want to look at all the work that goes into it. And so they just like throw it off as like, oh, you're naturally good at it. And so like definitely it's not something that you're given. They're not saying like, oh, here's a model minority, please eat it. They kind of just give it to you. Like they just put it in your plate, sneak it into your like plates as you eat, as you grow up. You just like internalize this like culture of constantly working yourself to the ground, never really talking about your struggles, never talking about your health, never talking about like what's hard, never asking for help, feeling shame if you don't understand things, feeling shame to ask for help, feeling shame to not be good enough, even though like, you know, there's stuff that goes into being good enough, right? There's resources, there's yourself, there's your support systems, and like a lot of times it's not easy to ask for these things because it's not expected of you to ask for these things. And so it's like, you know, in my opinion, I think the media is always behind a lot of things just because like the media is always like this cultural teacher to like whoever consumes it, right? Like what? I don't understand that reference, but yeah, I think culture is a pretty significant factor. Just because like when you look at the media, there's really two types of Asians. There's like the Asian that's good at everything, that's like the sidekick, that's like always reliable, and then there's like the antithesis of that. But like whenever they are the antithesis of that, whenever they're not anything less than perfect, they're always like the joke, you know? They're like the comedic relief. They're like, they're not good enough, so therefore they're funny. Therefore they're not like to be taken seriously. They're not to be like helped or anything. They're just to be laughed at and then put to the side. And then I definitely think that academia, as Gabe said, is also another big factor just because, you know, there's like this bootstraps theory of like, if you work hard enough, then you'll get it. But it's like, how do we do that if we don't have the resources, if you won't give us the resources, if you don't recognize that we're also struggling, if you're only seeing Asian and only seeing like your own idea of like, you should be successful without me giving you anything because I need to pit you against all these other people so that we can keep our, you know, acceptance rates up, money, et cetera, like all these things that go into it. Yeah.
Cool. So I know we only have a few minutes left, but I want to open the questioning to the audience. Is there any questions for our panel and their experiences, or even for Gabriel as well too? No questions? Okay, go ahead, Cash. Oh, hold on. Didn't want the mic on the. Didn't want it recorded. I gotta do my Phil Donahue.
How do you guys think will be a way to break this barrier?
I am a peer mentor for the PRIZE program. The PRIZE program is the API program. It's like Umoja or Puente. This is literally the first program I've ever been in that has been for API students. In all my education history, from K through 12, from 12 into college, higher education, all of it. So I've seen, like, through like my friends in Puente and Umoja, that it makes a difference. If you give us the attention that we deserve, just like the rest of the students of any other color, we're gonna show you what we're capable of. I mean, there's definitely the ones who have done the whole bootstraps thing, where we've forced ourselves to be something. But there's so many students that can, that just haven't been told they can. So I think programs like PRIZE or other programs that I've seen going to Apahi that start in elementary school, they make the difference. And we have the data on it too, that like, you know, there's, you know, more students staying in school, more interest, more participation, all that. So yeah, fund us.
For me, I believe that we have to learn about our ethnic studies in school, just like Gabriel said. Like it would be nice to learn about like Vietnamese history or Chinese history or like our Asian history in America, instead of just learning about white America in our history classes. Like we need to be more diverse in our in our public school systems.
Yeah, I think a big thing is that we have to be incredibly loud and blunt about these issues, that we have to open up and be vulnerable about these are issues that we deal with, and like we can't invoke change if we're going to be subtle. Like that's not going to spark any sort of like conversation if we try to be gentle about like what's happening. Like we have to be kind of, in a way, say, you know, I'm struggling with this, but it's a part of my life and I'm proud of it. I'm proud of having like these these experiences that I have, and like I don't want to lie about it. I want you to know what's going on for real.
Yeah, I definitely think that, like, for me personally, just like learning about the model minority myth was very life changing, just because like I've lived so much of my life just kind of like eating it without knowing that it was in my plate. And then when someone told me about it, I was like, I don't like broccoli and I don't like model minority myth. Please get it off my plate, kind of thing. So I think that deconstructing it is definitely an active process, both like for the community and like for myself personally. Like I, as an Asian American, recognize that this has been given to me, but I also want to actively reject it. And so like even now, like I still follow it without wanting to, right? Like I still am hesitant to ask for help. I'm still hesitant to talk about mental health. I'm still like hesitant to do these things. But like if I recognize that, like, you know, this is something that's been fed to me, it's not something that I need to be. There are better ways to live, not being squished by this broccoli that I don't like. So just doing that, and then also recognizing that like whoever you are also responsible of either deconstructing it or building it to be bigger than it is already. So like, a really quick aside, I know we're running out of time, but like, side story, my aunt is very successful, but when she talks about her success story, she always talks about it by like stepping on other Vietnamese Americans and being like, I was successful because I learned how to speak English, because I was able to pull myself up by my bootstraps. And she looks at my dad's side, where like 11 siblings, 3 of them have completed college, the other ones don't know what they're doing with their life. And she like we're all the same narrative, but like, you know, you can also still be not so nice to the people that are living the same exact story as you, just with different circumstances.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just being introspective,
Right.
deconstructing the bad broccolis, and eating the good stuff. Yeah.
So also to answer your question, Cash, there's this online social media campaign that the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center launched maybe about a year ago, called Remodel Minority. So it's just going against the whole model minority myth and trying to change the narrative of what that really looks like. So I know we're out of time. I know Gabriel's probably hanging out for a few minutes. If you have questions, we're also open to continuing this discussion in our Unite office. We do have the whole API Heritage Celebration next week. There's a couple brave spaces where we'll be kind of going more in depth on this topic. This could be a whole class for a few weeks, right, Ed? Yeah. We'll put that in the curriculum. So, you know, just to touch bases on it, we really flew right through this topic, but you can tell this is an important topic and it has a strong effect on our community. So I appreciate for your time and willingness to listen to the stories. Give it up for our panel and for Gabriel Garcia for coming out. And thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.